author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
It's all happening in the White House as members of the Biden family are being subpoenaed by the House Oversight Committee. Also, we're going to take a look at the latest situation in Ukraine and examine whether that's a losing battle or whether there's still fight left to be had against the Russian invaders. We'll also be talking liberty with legal affairs editor Mr. Scott DeCosenza, as always. You're here listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution.
The most scandal-ridden president in modern history. Now, who could that be? The contenders are wide, varied, and chasing that infamous prize. And we're very fortunate to have with us today to help us uncover who the winner of that particular contest might be. Liberty Nation's very own chief political correspondent and erstwhile satirist, Mr. Graham J. Noble, who wrote on this exact topic on the page of LibertyNation.com. Graham, thanks for being here.
Nice to be here, Mark.
So, Graham, what got into your head to investigate who was the most scandal-ridden of modern presidents?
Well, I guess it was the impetus was the latest subpoena issued by James Comer, who is the chair of the House Oversight Committee, and he has now issued a subpoena for a former White House counsel, because a former Biden White House counsel, because he's looking into the Biden's mishandling, or I guess you might say, well, I don't think there's anything alleged about it, his mishandling of classified documents.
Well, a Corvette is as safe as a locked room at Mar-a-Lago, right?
Right,
Next to
yeah.
a Corvette, locked Corvette. The Corvette was locked, but not the garage necessarily.
Right. Yes, and the files were not in the Corvette. Unfortunately, they were just like strewn about on the floor.
The convertible Corvette. They were in the locked Corvette. Yeah. The convertible.
Yeah, that's funny. I can almost imagine Joe Biden saying that.
They issued that subpoena. He issued that subpoena. So essentially, that's tying the two big investigations together, right?
Yes. Well, what Comer is wanting to know, and of course we don't know this yet, and obviously the ongoing investigation into Joe Biden's classified documents thing is being kept kind of very tightly under wraps. We don't know a lot of the details, in contrast to the Trump one, where every single detail of Trump's mishandling of classified documents or misstorage of them or whatever was like all over the media, every detail of it. But we don't know anything about Biden's. But here's the connection between the two, and that is that Comer is wondering, well, did Biden have some classified documents relating to the very countries from which Hunter Biden was pulling in money into Biden-related shell companies? So is there a connection there?
Well, that would be pretty interesting to find out. And I guess based on the answer to that first question, Graham, that you think the top contender for most scandal-ridden presidency of the modern era is Mr. President Joe Biden, former Vice President Joe Biden, right?
I believe so. And I would say very briefly, it's because I think Barack Obama had more scandals.
Right.
Obviously, Trump had thousands of scandals, but that was as defined by the left-leaning media and the Democrats. Everything Trump did, but if he sneezed, it was a scandal.
Yeah.
But Barack Obama had many very definite scandals.
Oh, yeah.
But I think Joe Biden's are more consequential because they involve him basically potentially being compromised with some of our most dangerous adversaries overseas. And I think so from a kind of a national security point of view, if you like, the Biden scandals are much more potentially consequential in a bad way.
Let's for our listening and viewing audience enumerate some of the wonderful scandals of the Barack Obama administration, because we keep hearing it, don't we, that he was so proud I had a scandal-free administration. And it reminds me of a meme that some of our listeners might be familiar with, or if they've ever watched The Simpsons, then Bart Simpson is tied to a lamppost and he's had his shorts pulled down. He says, "This is the worst day of my life." And his father comes up and says, "No, this is the worst day of your life so far." And what it seems to me that Barack Obama, he had a scandal-free presidency. Well, yes, it's a scandal-free presidency if you assume the media didn't report on all of the verifiable scandals you had. My favorite, let's go from my favorite first, and we'll hear your favorite, is the Fast and Furious scandal, in which he and Eric Holder decided to give a huge swath of firearms to criminals in the hopes of tracking them. And then they all just disappeared. What a shock.
Yeah.
What's your favorite?
Yeah. And of course, I believe that personally, I believe the whole agenda behind that was to, because basically what they did is the ATF basically almost coerced gun stores in border states to sell large numbers of weapons to straw purchasers, people who were buying those weapons for other people, the other people being Mexican drug cartels. And I think the point behind it was because Barack Obama always loved to say, the Democrats love to pretend that all of the gun violence in Mexico is because there's so many guns available in the US, and that's where they're getting them from. Well, yeah, they're getting them from them because the ATF made sure that they were getting them from here.
Yeah, it really is quite the scandal. I mean, there were many others. Let's jump forward a president. We've got Donald Trump. Now, his biggest scandal, the one that he got impeached for, literally rocked his presidency for the entire period, and was obviously the subject of 100,000 media articles, I would say. And that was the Russian collusion scandal, which turned out to be a complete con.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we now know from John Durham's investigation, Special Counsel John Durham, when he investigated the origins of that supposed scandal, the Russia collusion hoax, as I like to refer to it these days, he found out that, in fact, it was Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign that came up with the whole idea, and they put it out there, and then you got Christopher Steele, the former MI6 agent, who is on record as saying that he was desperate to make sure that Donald Trump did not become president. And so he produced that Steele dossier, which is all salacious gossip and media articles and stuff like that. And then, they just, everyone ran with it. The FBI, leapt into a full investigation that morphed into a special counsel investigation. People were arrested, went to prison, and the whole thing was just made up from very sketchy opposition research.
But of course, it did allow then President Barack Obama to spy on the Trump campaign with dodgy FISA requests, which of course that's all a bonus for them lot. Which brings us to current president, former vice president, Mr. President Joe Biden, and so he's getting a free pass from the media at present. As we get close to 2024, do you think they will start hammering him in to try and get him out of office? Because let's be fair, the media are activists and they have vested interest in what they're doing. Do you think they'll try and pressure Joe Biden?
I think that is kind of, to a certain extent, that has already begun in a very low-key way. I think it will intensify, although I don't believe that the media will use the whole financial scandals and the Hunter Biden thing and all that. They're not going to use that. I believe they're going to say, well, he's perhaps too old to serve a second term, and he's perhaps they'll find a polite way of saying, he's not all there, upstairs, in terms of if he can get up the stairs without falling, that is, he's not all there. And maybe we need some, fresh blood, blah, blah, blah. I think they'll go with that. I don't think they're going to continue to play down the whole financial scandal thing.
Well, fortunately, Gavin Newsom's been running his own shadow campaign for that just eventuality. We'll be back with Graham J. Noble after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent, Mr. Graham J. Noble. Now, earlier in the show, we talked the scandal-ridden presidencies of the past, but now I want to look to the presidencies of the future, Graham. Now, let's say that Donald Trump doesn't end up in prison, and even if he does, he still continues his campaign. And so he's the nominee for 2024, and that Joe Biden manages to realize that he's actually living in the White House and sticks in there for president to run for re-election in 2024. How do you see this going? Now, I'm not asking for predictions, but on who will win, but how do you see the campaigns playing out?
Well, of course, from Joe Biden's point of view, the biggest problem he's got is the economy. And that's why we've got this vast, I would call it, to use modern terms, a vast disinformation campaign being run by the Democrats and their kind of loyal media to basically say to the American people, you guys simply don't seem to understand that this is a great economy. What's wrong with you? This is fantastic, and why are you so down on the economy? Because it's the best economy we've ever had. And so they're desperately trying to convince the American people to, I think it was a quote from one of the Marx brothers, who once said something like, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? And that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of thing they're doing right now to the American people. So Joe Biden's biggest problem is the economy. Donald Trump's biggest problem is
Donald Trump.
His biggest problem is, I've always thought that one of his biggest problems is there are certain times when he should just keep his mouth shut and not react and not respond to certain things. And the other problem he's got, of course, is that the perception, at least, is that he is committed all kinds of terrible crimes. And so that's the battle we've got. That's the two biggest issues for the two candidates, I believe.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that the media are trying to convince the American public that they're living through the best economy they've ever had. It's almost insulting, isn't it? It's like you may look at your bank account and realize how little you have. You may go to the grocery store and realize how little your normal grocery spend will actually get you.
Yeah.
But that's just because you're stupid. This is what they're saying, right?
Yeah. That's right.
You just don't get it because you're too stupid to realize how good everything is for you.
And I would say, just very quickly, Mark, I would say that's always been a trait, I believe, in my opinion, it's always been a trait of Democrats, is that they simply just look down upon everyone else. They just do.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. It's this unearned elitism that we see there. Now, it is true to some extent on the Republican side as well, but it's almost endemic in the Democrat side. So I think Ronald Reagan called the bigotry of low expectations. And they really epitomize that, especially this modern crop. So we have Donald Trump, and now you say that his biggest worry, one of his major worries, is that he doesn't keep quiet when he should do. He takes the bait for pretty much everything. And I wonder, that's absolutely, I believe that's absolutely what got him to this position where half the country can't stand him. I believe that's absolutely where it got him. However, now that he's under 4 indictments for 90 plus felonies, my personal opinion here is, speak to your heart's content, Donald. Get it out there, But they're trying to block him, aren't they? The judges are slamming gag orders on him. But I think that it will be that very, what's the right word? That bull in a china shop approach that will set him free. What do you think of that?
I sort of agree. I really do. I mean, basically, after before Joe Biden got into the White House, the common refrain, even from many conservatives, when it came to talking about Trump, was, well, he's a good president. He's been doing a good job as president, but I just wish he would shut up. I just wish he would stop tweeting. He's got a big mouth. Blah blah blah. I've heard this so many times from friends, people I know, and I think, but I think you're right. I think this using the legal system against him has been, and it's like a full on legal broadside, trying to get him for everything they possibly can. And I think and certain polls have even shown that even a lot of Democrat voters think they've crossed the line to actual political persecution.
At least 30% believe that.
And so now Donald Trump has gone from being the bully to being the victim. And so I think you raise a good point, Mark. I think if he can, the more he can basically speak out against what is happening to him now, I think that doesn't work out badly for him.
In 2016, what he really had going for him was that Hillary Clinton was the heir apparent, and everybody. I mean, not me, actually. I was, from the very start, Donald Trump's going to win this. Even from the beginning of the primaries, I was positive he was going to win. I wasn't sure I wanted him to win.
Right.
I was sure he's going to win. But yeah, Hillary Clinton was the heir apparent. He was not even within the Republican Party realm against all the other people who were in the primary. And so he was the complete underdog. And America loves an underdog. It's the subject of all the best movies out of America, is the underdog makes good. And that really helped him being in that position. But then in 2020, he had the pandemic to deal with. I don't think anybody can really handle a once in a generation pandemic or the restrictions that flowed from it. But he wasn't the underdog, not by a long shot. He was the president of the United States. But now, 2024, he's the most belabored man in politics, and he may or may not be guilty of some of the crimes for which he's being accused, but he's certainly not guilty of all of them. And many of them are novel approaches. We spoke with Liberty Nations Legal Affairs editor Scott D. Cosenza, and he talks about how new many of these charges are, that nobody's ever been charged with them before. Final word for you, Graham. How do you think this contest, this rumble in the jungle, this thriller in Manila, how do you think it's going to play out?
What you're asking me for a prediction of who's going to win the next presidential election?
Yes, let's hear it.
To be perfectly honest with you, Mark, I don't believe that I can give you an honest answer to that, because it would drive so many people completely insane if I said what I actually believe is going to happen. I don't know. I don't see how Biden, wins just based on the economy. But again, it comes back to this thing: is can the Democrats somehow convince enough Americans that actually the economy is much better than they think it is? And I think that's going to be the big game changer there. But normally, history tells you a president with this bad an economy does not get re-elected.
Let history be our guide. Graham J. Noble, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
It's been almost 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, and despite international support for the plucky Ukrainian nation, many people are wondering if it's time to re-examine the situation. Now, we're fortunate to have with us today an expert on all things military, who's a retired Air Force pilot, former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller. So when he speaks, I tend to listen on these things, Mr. David Patterson. Dave, thanks for being with us again.
Happy to be with you, Mark.
So, Dave, let me lay out what I'm thinking on this, and you give me your analysis if you could, please. At the beginning, there was a lot of talk about how, at the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia war, there was a lot of talk about how the West will not give in to Vladimir Putin, that there can be no peace negotiation. And it seems now that a lot of people are backtracking on that and looking for a peaceful solution, even if that means, or a reasonably peaceful end, even if that means giving some territory up to Vladimir Putin. Now, my perspective on this, Dave, is that I've pretty much thought from the beginning that I couldn't see how Ukraine could win this war. And was I just was I wildly wrong then, but just coincidentally right now, or was it obvious to other people that there wasn't a way that Ukraine by itself, even with international weapons supplies and cash supplies, could win the war?
I think that you're probably sort of right. And what I mean is, yes, what I mean is that in the beginning there was some expectation that with a modest amount of U.S. leadership and the Europeans' support, that Ukraine could, in fact, make life really miserable for the Russians, and that they would push them, if not out of Crimea, at least out of the Donbas region. And that was an expectation that was reasonably well-founded. What has happened in the interim, of course, is that the United States in the Biden administration has piecemealed out that support, so that they have in fact allowed this crisis to go on and on and on, and many people now kind of talk about it in terms of World War I, the trench warfare. It's not really that, quite frankly, but that's what it seems to be. There's very little advance on either the Russian part or the Ukrainians. Maybe a little bit more for the Ukrainians because of the fact that they had this counteroffensive, and although it has not been as successful as we might like it to be, it has been nonetheless kind of just slugging it out and getting some of the territory back. But time has a way of really destroying momentum, and it's certainly happening in the case of Ukraine, particularly happening in the case of the U.S. Congress too, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, the willingness to hand over cash and weapons. I know it's not all just cash. It's weapons, access to weapon supplies.
Right.
And I know that there's a lot more hesitation now, but I suspect that part of that is also because there isn't a clear end game that's been defined. And I know that there have been reported rumblings from the inner circle of President Vladimir Zelensky that even people on his staff are beginning to realize that this is not a situation that they can win as things stand at the moment. You talk about the length of time going on. You're right that the like an open wound, it's kind of festered. But what's happened is that without any particular movement back and forth across the battle lines, that each side Russia has essentially been able to bolster what it has, because it's got a very clear defined line in that to the Donbas region, and they've essentially been able to just solidify what they're doing there while Ukraine batters itself against what appears to be a fairly solid wall. And so it's a war of attrition, but the side that's being eroded here is Ukraine, I think. I mean, that Russia historically, it has lost many wars. Even in the last 100 years, it's lost many wars. It's not an unbeatable foe. But very rarely have they ever thrown less than 500,000 people at a conflict before deciding whether to really commit or not. And I think we're not even near that point yet, are we, Dave?
No, we're not. And they have lots of people, and Ukraine doesn't. So it's really unfortunate that we've gotten to this point, because early on in the conflict, the Ukraine had a tremendous amount of momentum. Russia had totally misunderstood what they were up against in terms of the the will and the enthusiasm of the Ukraine fighters. Over time, that's clearly, eroded because of the constant conflict, the constant combat, which is fatiguing, if nothing else.
Yes.
And additionally, which doesn't do much for morale. You're starting to see even their staunchest allies, Poland, Romania, and are starting to get a little wobbly on what they're willing to do. But I think you made the point, and I think that it is the most degrading in terms of how Ukraine goes forward, and that is that no one really, particularly the United States, has a strategy for an end game. They can't even describe an end game. And this business about as long as it takes, I mean, how could anything be dumber? And well, I mean, I'm giving a ceiling here to the Biden administration, and I shouldn't really do that because they never fail to live down to my expectations. But it's true. I mean, Biden had an opportunity when he addressed the American people to say, this is what we are doing. This is what we expect to achieve. This is the end game. And he didn't do it. And there's a reason, I believe, and that's because he doesn't have an end game. He doesn't have a strategy.
Well, I think, Dave, a lot of that is due to the very real and very beneficial politicking that the political capital that could be gained. The Biden administration, as many other administrations would have been wont to do, is they had the opportunity to look like a wartime cabinet, a wartime administration, which is a fantastic boost to your campaign, especially if you're an unpopular president, to be on the front lines of a war. I mean, look how popular Zelensky is. The whole world is pretty much in awe of. It's essentially an actor who managed to get elected president. But with taking all that political kudos, President Biden, he positioned himself as a wartime president, and he's talked about being, in a wartime president without actually having to involve and have the coffins come home draped in flags. But now that it looks as though this is not going to be a very clear-cut victory, if a victory at all, for Ukraine, surely he has to accept some of the responsibility of being a wartime president who lost.
I think you're right. And I think one of the things that is, being a former deputy comptroller, I'm going to think in these kinds of terms. But if you want to look to see where the enthusiasm and support of the American people are, look to see what they fund. And in this recent House of Representatives bill that was passed to the stopgap measure that pushes the funding into January and February, you'll find that there's no allowance for Ukraine or Israel or the border. And because they want to deal with those issues separately. And I think that they want to deal with them in a way that the Biden administration will not like.
I think you could be right there, Dave. Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure being with you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Blind Mules at the Supreme Court. It is not a Disney movie. It is a case being heard by the justices coming up. And to discuss all things legal, as we often do on the show, we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, also host of the excellent Uprising podcast, who's here to tell us who blinded the mules, which Disney production they're starring in, and what's happening. Scott?
Well, this is not about humans identifying as four-legged creatures and arguing appellate
Not
cases.
that there's anything wrong with that.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. Instead, this is about a woman who was caught while traveling from Mexico to the United States in a car, and authorities found, I think, close to 30 kilograms of methamphetamine in the car. They charged her with it, and during her criminal trial, she argued that she had no knowledge that those drugs were in the vehicle. It was not her car. It happened to be her boyfriend's car. And there was whether you believe her or not, there was some plausible story she offered about why she was driving this vehicle at this time. And again, not her car. So how do you impute the knowledge that she had the drugs to her, which is an element of the crime? The government has to prove part of the convicting her includes proving an element that she knew what she was doing, right? We don't prosecute unwitting or unknowing drug couriers in this country. Well, what they did is they bring in an expert from the DEA that says, well, these cars, if you can think, you have to sort of paint a scene, and I want to sort of make you think about it this way. So you're in the courtroom and they build up this person, this Ms. X from the DEA. And Ms. X we talk about her 20, 30-year history there, and like super expert in the cartels and liaison with Mexican and Colombia law enforcement, and leading up to this great crescendo of now, would a Mexican cartel unwittingly, would they leave 25 to 30 kilograms of methamphetamine with someone who didn't know? Would they do that? And they say, well, no, typically we don't ever see them doing that. It's too great a risk for them. The person could do anything with that vehicle and the cartel might not know. And so it imputes to the juror's mind that the expert is testifying about this particular defendant, but they're not. And if you think about it in another way, like if you were charged with assaulting your neighbor, for instance, would the police be allowed to come by and say, well, we don't know if Mark assaulted his neighbor, but typically anytime somebody's assaulted, it's always the neighbor to the north or something like that, right? Like, yeah. That's just how it works. Well, they're imputing guilt to you, but there's been no actual evidence or proof that you are a guilty party. And so this has been allowed under I see you want to come in?
I do. That strikes me, Scott, as particularly dangerous road of prosecution to go down, because you're convicting people. Now, the young lady in question, she might in fact be guilty. I have no idea, but I don't think it really matters, because
this has nothing to do with her guilt. This has only to do with whether the government is allowed to basically send somebody to court and say, people like this are usually guilty.
Well,
that's what they're saying.
Yeah, what they're doing here, Scott, is that they're taking a generalization and using it to persecute or criminally convict somebody based on a generalization, or another way of looking at it is a statistic. Now, don't get me wrong here, Scott. I'm all for statistics, but if we start prosecuting people and convicting people based on statistics rather than an actual crime, I fear that way lies madness, doesn't it?
Mark, it seems,
or salvation, depending on how you look.
It seems to me this is an outrage, and I would just like everybody listening or watching to think about if they were being tried for some criminal charge and the government was able to bring some expert in that had no evidence that they did the crime, but just testified that people like them typically do these crimes. And of course, the inference for the jurors is then to believe that the particular defendant did this crime because of that evidence. It seems
men with beards typically commit this particular type of crime. Therefore, everybody with a beard is probably guilty. Mm-hmm. Now, Scott, what I find confusing is that this has actually made it to the Supreme Court. I'm not sure how that process would work in this particular case, because surely this would have been appealed at a lower court first, and it stood in the lower court, in another court, an appellate court.
This has never been successfully appealed, and so that's why we're here now. And you have to remember, Mark, all the kind of pieces have to fall in together to get to the court, right? That's one of the reasons why we have for many issues that people are kind of like rooting for a case to go to the Supreme Court, like a guns case or something like that. Or abortion or any number of the other, like, really, this isn't typically a hot button, this particular evidentiary issue.
Pineapple on pizza. Yeah.
But you have to have the right set of facts that, this is an isolated issue. It's the only issue present on appeal. And you have a court that wants the case. They voted to take it.
So, Scott, when the justices hear the arguments on this and when they make their determination, it seems to me this could go two ways. One, they can determine that it was impermissible for the government to put forward a witness that would speak in generalizations because that would impute certain information towards the jury. And that's quite a clear-cut ending to the case. However, if the justices determined that they were allowed to do it, doesn't that mean that government cases will do this more and more and more, and to the detriment of civil liberty in the country?
You make an interesting point, Mark. If prosecutors,
if I were determined to put people who I felt were guilty away, I would be doing that every time.
yes, but this goes to this. Yeah, I think that you may be overstating the universe of evidence that this is applicable to, but at the same time, it's quite troubling. I think that I clearly, if it's not obvious, hope and think that the court should disallow this kind of evidence, because I think it violates people's right to a fair trial by putting on a lay jury the level of sophistication required to disregard this kind of evidence, and I don't think it should be on them to do so. I think that's an appropriate role for the judge to say, no, it's more likely that a jury is going to see this evidence as applied against the particular defendant rather than as kind of generalized statistical information.
Yeah, I never underestimate the deviousness of those who seek to undermine civil liberties. Now, Scott, if I may, I know you hate giving predictions on cases, but I think in this one, as you say, there's a very specific set of evidentiary elements to it. What's your prediction?
Well, one of the things, I don't know that I'm predicting this, but I'm with keen interest, we'll be seeing whether or not we get a kind of merging of the wings of the court on this to agree, meaning it seems like this would appeal to both a Justice Sotomayor and a Justice Gorsuch, for instance, but from kind of atypical partners in seeing much of the constitutional law, and that's just sort of an interesting angle because it's an anti-establishment kind of a thing and also a lefty kind of a thing, right? These sorts of protections, and so I'll be curious to see if there's a marriage of the minds there when the opinion comes out.
When worlds collide at the Supreme Court, and we've got just enough time for one more quick question, Scott. Guns. There's stuff happening with guns at the Supreme Court. Give me the quick rundown.
Well, the big news, I think, since we've spoken last is that they took a bump stock case. This is, of course, Donald Trump's leading the banning of the bump stocks by just signing his pen to a regulation that said what was previously legal and ruled upon as legal by the ATF. So bump stock manufacturers asked the ATF, so they said, is this what we want to do? Is this okay and permissible under state law or under federal law? And they got letters that said, yes, it is okay. And then later on, through a new interpretation of the law under the Trump administration, it removed these rights from gun owners and made them instant felons if they continued to possess these devices. That's now gone up to the Supreme Court, I think out of the Fifth Circuit. And I think it's great that they're going to settle it. And once again, I think it's probably not hard to think, not hard to imagine which way I think they should rule on it. Given that, one day Americans were, according to their government, legally able to possess this thing. And then the next day they were told, no, you're a felon if you do. Oh, and by the way, no compensation. So we have a takings clause that says if the government wants to take your property for public use, and I think canceling its legality might be considered a taking. So anyway, fascinating issues there as well.
Scott will be writing on this on the pages of libertynation.com and no doubt discussing it on, as I mentioned again, the excellent Uprising podcast. Do go and listen to it. Scott, thanks ever so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to say a special thank you to our guests, Graham J. Noble, Dave Patterson, and Scott DeCasenza for taking the time to come into the studio and join us here on the show. And of course, I'd like to extend my thanks to you, the listeners out there in Radioland who take the time every week to tune in and join us for these fun discussions. Once again, thank you all, and we'll see you soon. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.